Biden did it on purpose. But why? Why would a president do this to his own country? No sane first world nation opens its borders to the world, promising the poorest people on the planet that they can have endless free taxpayer-funded services if they show up and break your laws. That's not just stupid, it's suicidal to change the racial mix of the country. That's the reason, to reduce the political power of people whose ancestors lived here and dramatically increase the proportion of Americans newly arrived from the third world. Now, I know that the left and all the little gatekeepers on Twitter become literally hysterical if you use the term replacement, if you suggest that the Democratic Party is trying to replace the current electorate, the voters now casting ballots, with new people, more obedient voters from the third world. But they become hysterical because that's what's happening, actually. Let's just say it, that's true.
With the recent election results of some far-right groups across Europe, a conspiracy theory full of holes is getting some political legitimacy in ruling circles. White nationalists, a contradictory concept in and of itself, think that white people, or people of European background, are being replaced by so-called lesser races in an effort to eliminate them. How replacement occurs when the original population still remains and isn't going anywhere isn't exactly explained. Likewise, fears over Europeans becoming minorities in their own countries, something completely unfounded, by the way, is extra silly because what exactly are they afraid of? Do they treat minorities badly or something? Anyways, called the Great Replacement, or earlier just white genocide, it's a conspiracy theory that combines various fears around social issues, economic insecurities, and ignorance of history, all the while giving a simple explanation and solution, something inherent to the ahistorical and non-materialist approach the right takes towards analyzing issues. Let's see why this is a dangerous and very stupid idea so that you can recognize and counter this garbage when it surfaces. Let's define this conspiracy theory a bit more carefully. The Great Replacement claims that there is a deliberate attempt by a nebulous and loosely defined group of elites, a topic we'll come to later, to replace a white population with immigrants from non-white countries. Proponents suggest that the replacement is not just racial but also cultural, threatening the values, civilization, freedoms, and everything else that white society has built. They say this is happening via large influxes of immigrants into their countries, which are causing demographic shifts that undermine Western civilization, which basically means white people being in charge. They claim that the overall goal is to weaken and ultimately erase European cultural and ethnic identity. Of course, why this is being done isn't really explained, instead opting for a series of sinister theys wanting to destroy the West for reasons. The very obvious reasons for immigration, like war, usually caused by those same European countries via NATO or US-aligned action, economic exploitation, systematically keeping imperial periphery nations underdeveloped so that opportunities are better within the imperial core, or the economic necessities of European economies are never mentioned. No Syrian would be in Europe if the US didn't destabilize and destroy Syria, likewise with Central America and the Caribbean with the US. Also, the entire concept of whiteness, Western values, European culture, etc. are flawed, and I've covered it extensively in another video which you really should watch to get that side of the argument. Generally though, and here's kind of the crux, whiteness is considered pure, with one-drop rule type classification qualifying you for not being white. It really is just racism. Someone can be mixed race in Germany, be born there, speak German, live Germanly, whatever that means, and still not be white to people who think like this. It's almost like they're hell-bent on this ridiculous theory for political ends. Yeah, we'll get there. But where did this theory come from? Well, aside from its very deep roots in white nationalist and Nazi ideologies, the formal modern conspiracy theory was created by French white nationalist writer Renaud Camus in his 2011 book, The Great Replacement. His rhetoric has met some appreciation by various far-right movements in Europe and the US, but the content is very unhinged, claiming immigrants are occupiers and colonizers. How they do that without political power or military presence is of course not explained. That Europeans will be replaced in 1 or 2 generations, which would require importing hundreds of millions, a literal impossibility. And in a very rich bit of irony, likens the entire situation to Vichy France, and apparently people like him are not the Nazis in this made-up scenario. It's all just very silly. Interesting how settler colonial movements by Europeans are always okay in these people's eyes, but the supposed inverse, which isn't happening, is not okay. Anyway, his theory is built on earlier influences, drawing from works like those of Jean Raspail's The Camp of the Saints, which depicts the destruction of white Western society by immediate mass immigration from the global south through the nefarious scheming of the evil blacks and browns. The novel is dogshit, basically imposing Lord of the Rings Orc-level dehumanization on anyone who isn't white, and unsurprisingly this has been a significant influence on the narrative of racial and cultural invasion within white supremacist rhetoric. René Benet's theory of racism, by the way, have you noticed how they're all French? My French racism aside, his book links racial purity to the survival of Western civilization and argued that race mixing was a threat to racial and cultural integrity. a book called My Bible by Hitler, warned that Americans of Nordic ancestry were being pushed out and outbred by alien peoples, mainly Jews and people from Eastern and Southern Europe. Said groups now being considered white, such as Ukrainians, Italians, and Polish people. This just goes to show how malleable this supposedly immutable trait of race really is. Also, it's all basically bullshit. Refer to my video on race here. Back to the video in just a second, let's hear from Blinkist. Did you know that the typical social media user spends 2 hours and 23 minutes per day using social platforms? Though somewhat entertaining, imagine using that time for something educational and fun instead. That's where Blinkist comes in. It's an app that helps summarize the major core points from over 6,600 non-fiction titles and podcasts in just 15 minutes. Perfect for when you're in between chores, on the go, or with a little bit of dead time. With thousands of books on offer in 27 different categories, it's a great way to get bite-sized packs of information, both in text and audio format if you so choose. The diversity in thought presented is very wide, and they even have neat little recommendations for other related reading you could do to contrast with different perspectives. I know several people with busy lives that without Blinkist would have never actively read before. Today's recommendation is Ha-Joon Chang's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, which is one of many options they have in their politics, economy, and philosophy sections. The work, which I've recommended previously, explores the myths surrounding capitalism and challenges conventional notions about free markets, globalization, and the role of the state. I was pleasantly surprised by how well the ideas were presented, as well as how convenient it was to pick up. A great thing to read or listen to with any downtime. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer for you guys. Click the link in the description to start your free 7-day trial and get 40% off of premium membership. And at no additional cost to you, Blinkist has a new feature, Blinkist Spaces. This feature allows you to create a space with friends or family where you can recommend titles to each other. All members of a shared space can access all titles in the space, with or without a Blinkist premium subscription. So what are you waiting for? Get your 7-day free trial and 40% off of Blinkist Premium by using my link in the description below. Big thanks to Blinkist for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is very appreciated. Alright, back to the video. As a result of its popularity, the Great Replacement has become an integral part of contemporary far-right politics. For example, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has echoed the theory in his rhetoric, amplifying the idea that liberal and left-wing elites are actively carrying out a demographic replacement to erode national identity and sovereignty. For reasons, I guess. They never mention why. Of course, ardent supporters can be found in the US as well, where some Republican senators and former Fox News host turned Twitter personality chud Tucker Carlson echoing similar white nationalist garbage. Carlson has repeatedly promoted the theory on his programs, framing it as a legitimate concern white people should have about demographic changes, and that it's being coordinated by liberals in order to secure loyal voters for the Democrats. Which is also wrong, refer to the 2 articles at the beginning of the video. I assume he's not familiar with how Cuban diaspora people vote, I guess. This slow normalization unsurprisingly shifts the conversation hard right and has played a significant role in the rise in acts of violence as seen in numerous terrorist attacks carried out by white nationalists who cite the Great Replacement conspiracy theory as a motivation for their actions. While American proponents tend to equate the elites doing all this with liberals alone, the Great Replacement is littered with much clearer anti-Semitic views. They accuse Jews of being the ultimate masterminds behind mass immigration and merely collaborate with opportunistic liberals in power, along with references to ideas of racial purity and other classic Nazi nonsense. These people are idiots. It's all economics, which unsurprisingly is the #1 motivation for migration aside from war. Why? Well, centuries of colonial exploitation and unequal exchange have a way of destabilizing and preventing the development of the imperial periphery for the benefit of the imperial core. Watch my video on this here. Anyway, these clowns actually claim that non-whites and non-Westerners invade and take over territories, commit fraud to receive public benefits, and take jobs of citizens, which are apparently only white in their imagination. The evidence says otherwise, but we're getting there. One of the more disgusting claims they make is that these immigrants are violently preying on white women with the goal of making them carry non-white children. This is a weaponization of misogyny that uses the defilement of white women as a way to legitimize violence against immigrant and non-white men. Of course, the opinions, preferences, or ideas of white women are completely absent from Great Replacement rhetoric. For fascists, women, even if they're white, are baby-making machines and not human beings. In addition to using Jews and women as scapegoats in their fantasy world, they misuse historical events to support this nonsense. The argument goes that contemporary immigration is a form of reverse colonization, wherein immigrants impose their cultures on European societies in a way that Europeans allegedly did not during their colonial endeavors. Hopefully I don't need to explain why this is stupid and wrong. Moreover, there isn't one European nation that has had its culture changed by immigrants. A nebulous concept, as culture is fluid and has always evolved through exposure to other cultures. Why do they think they're a quote-unquote Christian continent? A few loanwords and new, actually edible cuisine doesn't make, I don't know, Germany less German. Don't worry though, there are other crazy conspiracy theories they throw in the mix. In addition to Jews, women, and liberal whites, this narrative has managed to awkwardly bolt on other fears and conspiracies, such as the Eurabia conspiracy, which claims that European leaders are conspiring with Muslim-majority countries to impose Sharia on Europe. Inshallah. That's a joke. Basically combining Islamophobia with centuries-old anti-Semitism, and voila, you have a global threat. No matter what, for some racists, some Semite is always the cause and issue, seemingly. Finally, this racist theory wouldn't be complete without mentioning the all-time champion of conspiracy theories, cultural Marxism, or Judeo-Bolshevism in its nonsense renaming. In reality, a nonsense term, it's used to apparently imply that whites have been prevented from exercising their freedom of speech due to the infiltration of non-European values. This just means you can't say slurs. Likewise, non-European values is almost always just code for Islam. Let's be very clear about this point. Overt Islamophobia is, in liberal societies, still taboo, and only barely so. But the only reason anyone comes up with such a clumsy, meaninglessly broad, and completely idiotic phrase such as non-European values is as a euphemism for something they don't like but refuse to define. They're not talking about Polynesian culture here. Likewise, not one of these idiots can actually draw up a list of so-called European values they don't either entirely disagree with, liberal nation-state stuff they want to heavily modify, women's rights, ideas of the family, etc., or stuff they want to entirely abolish, freedom of expression, religion, right of agency, particularly for women, etc., etc. This isn't even mentioning the Christian identity stuff some of them cling on to as a core European value, when Christian identification in Europe is at an all-time low. Anyway, let's shift to demographics. The Great Replacement claims that non-whites are or will be the primary beneficiaries of this demographic shift, apparently enjoying unrestricted access to territory, public benefits, jobs, and the bodies of white women. This is again pure projection at its finest and has genuinely zero evidence. This projection extends all the way to portraying Western nations as being under siege, where the very essence of Western identity is at risk of being eroded by, again, nebulous and nefarious external forces without explainable reasons. No matter how stupid we find these, though, they do serve a purpose. The narrative of an existential threat serves to justify extreme measures once in power, including severely restricting immigration, usually by race or ethnicity, restricting civil freedoms, promoting so-called racial purity, and eventually even genocide. Now let's talk about why it's bullshit. We'll start with immigration. Immigration does play a significant role in population growth across countries in the West and really globally. But not in the way they think, rather the opposite actually. Before we get into this, let's just first show how silly all of this is with a simple fact. Since these bullshit ideas were born in Europe, let's start with Europe. Various immigration waves of the century have caused the far right everywhere to decry the death and overrunning of Europe by foreigners. Do you want to know the actual numbers? 6%. 6% of the EU's population is of non-EU citizenship, meaning mostly non-European background, because they don't make a distinction between Syrians or Ukrainians in the stats. There are white people included in the 6%. If you calculate the number of people born outside of the EU, the number is 9%. These people are foaming at the mouth, wanting to start gas chambers and ovens over 6%. Let's look at the US. The Pew Research Institute looked at immigration between 1965 and 2015. New immigrants, their children, and grandchildren. This influx of immigrants accounted for 55% of US population growth. Were current trends to continue, future immigrants and their descendants would account for 88% of the US population increase from 2015 to 2065. Most of those who immigrate are working-age adults, making them more likely than US-born residents to be in their childbearing years. They also have higher age-adjusted birth rates than people born in the US, which further contributes to population growth. Furthermore, immigrants are expected to account for nearly all the growth in the Hispanic and Asian populations from 1965 and 2015. So what makes this not replacement? After all, a projection of 88% of the population will be immigrant background. The horror! Well, interestingly enough, for the American example, the US and other American settler colonies became, and since have been almost entirely immigrant background in origin, because their nations founded through settler colonialism and the mass extinction of the native population. So, from the point of view of white nationalists, all European settlers are violent illegal immigrants who actually did all of the horrible things that they are afraid of having done to them. They're scared of being wiped out as they did to others. Well, the major difference here is that immigration isn't a genocide, and no foreign population is settling on so-called white land and expelling Europeans or European background people. Immigration isn't violent. Immigrants moving next to you or having children with a white person doesn't harm you. You'd be replaced if they, say, walked in and began ethnically cleansing the place you live, herding you into reservations, and inflicting on your group conditions of life calculated to bring about your group's physical destruction in whole or in part. Basically, what white Americans did to the Native Americans. Otherwise, white or European populations remain, making it very clear there is no genocide and no replacement. Colonization, on the other hand, the type Europe engaged in for centuries, is violent, which is why they call large migrations of people invasions full of colonizers, as if they were an army. It's projection, plain and simple. It's not replacement because there's no killing and the original population remains and will remain indefinitely. Canada is basically in the same boat, around 120,000 arrivals per year since the 1800s, with future projections showing that immigration will account for 82% of Canadian population growth. This is just the natural course of developed nations. Japan is facing a similar situation and will soon also have to start accepting immigrants if they want their economy to remain solvent. Anyway, on to the economics. In New Zealand, the story is very similar. Immigrant inflows do not displace New Zealand-born workers, but instead create positive knock-on effects. Immigrants tend to have lower returns on qualifications obtained abroad, but still significantly contribute to the economy. Over time, immigrants integrate into the labor market, showing similar success factors as native workers after 10 to 15 years. This integration supports the overall economic and demographic stability of the country, as immigrants help sustain economic growth by filling labor shortages and contributing to both urban and rural communities. It's not very different in Europe either. Practically every Western European country is suffering from labor shortages and an aging population, which greatly jeopardize potential economic growth. Their solution is to bring in workers from elsewhere, which isn't a novel concept. The contributions of these immigrant workers and their economic and social integration within their new countries follow similar trends to that of New Zealand. Of course, if you don't like the idea of immigrants at all, you can try to increase white birth rates to do the same thing, meaning filling vacancies in the job market, but that hasn't been successful basically anywhere, most famously of all in Hungary. And kids need years to grow, while the economy needs workers now. On that topic though, this is something to emphasize. Proponents of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory have to misinterpret, stretch, and mold demographic data to support their claims, which are false. Let's take one of their favorite stats, total fertility rate. The total fertility rate is a measure of the intensity of childbearing in a specific year. It does not reflect the average number of children a woman will ultimately have in her lifetime. This leads these clowns to have and promote distorted perceptions of immigrant fertility rates. Take Switzerland, since it's a common example these people mention. The total fertility rate for foreign women in Switzerland gives an inflated impression of their ultimate fertility, as many women have higher fertility rates immediately after arrival, which subsequently lessens as time goes on. In fact, by age 40, Swiss women have slightly more children on average than foreign women. Even in a few cases where immigrant birth rates are higher, they quickly normalize to the rate of the receiving country. In other words, no crowding out or replacement is happening. Again. The UN's Replacement Migration Report summarizes the silliness of this aspect of the Great Replacement pretty well when they said that long-term demographic projections are far from credible as forecasts, and because of that, long-term future trends in fertility, mortality, and migration trends are in fact literally unknowable. For example, the UN report suggests that Germany would need to admit 188 million immigrants by 2050 to maintain its working-age population, a figure that is simply impossible, but it's useful for demonstration. Back in the US, there's a persistent narrative that immigration leads to increased crime and social disorder. In fact, it's also available in Europe. However, all evidence points to the opposite conclusion, namely that immigrant populations are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Research has consistently found that immigrants, regardless of their legal status, are less likely to be incarcerated and have lower crime rates than the native-born population. I made a video about the general distortion of crime statistics and other social issues in a much earlier video here. When the Great Replacement fails on this point, they often argue that immigrants take jobs from native-born workers and depress wages. But here again, the evidence is overwhelming in the other direction. Comprehensive studies have shown that the impact of immigration on native employment and wages is minimal. There is little evidence to support the idea that immigration has a large or systematic negative effect on native employment or wages. Also, it's native capitalists that would be hiring foreign labor, intentionally underpaying them and reducing wages in an attempt to exploit them. In that case, it's capitalists that are the root of the issue, not immigrants. This nuance is of course never touched on, unsurprisingly. Related to the jobs issue, immigrants are said to hurt the economy of the society they move to. This is also nonsense. Immigrants contribute significantly to the economy by starting businesses, creating jobs, not taking them, and increasing consumer demands because, the more people, the higher the demand for goods and services. For example, in Silicon Valley, Chinese and Indian immigrants have founded nearly 25% of high-tech companies since 1980. Go anywhere in Europe and you'll surely find a fruit stand or a cafe or something owned by an immigrant person. It doesn't take a genius to realize that these things have a positive impact on the economy of the nation they're residing in. This stuff isn't just true for the US either. In New Zealand, immigration has improved the economy significantly and no negative economic impacts on native workers are to be found. Increased immigration resulted in generally lower consumer prices, improved fiscal balance, and expanded trade. Similarly, in Greece, immigrants have positively impacted the agricultural and tertiary sectors, and there is no significant displacement of native workers aside from already economically depressive conditions. This complementary relationship between immigrants and native labor forces is crucial for maintaining economic productivity and growth. That's the crux of the matter. These spooky elites aren't bringing in immigrants to get rid of white people. Immigration policy is instead guided by economic factors to maintain economic growth, which requires working-age people, and lots of them, especially in highly developed industrialized economies where fertility rates are lower across the board, including for, eventually, these foreign-born populations. That doesn't mean there aren't issues with unregulated immigration, etc., etc. Of course there are, but they're not the big boogeyman that these people are painting them out to be. And this talk of fucking elites is so tired. Please just read some, apply materials analysis, for the love of God. About the cultural erosion by way of immigration bit. Here, yet again, studies are clear that diverse environments foster innovation and creativity by combining different perspectives and skills. This conversation gets boring because the facts are boring. There's no cultural crusade or clashes of ways of life. Instead, cultures intermixing generates net benefits that are empirically verifiable, unsurprisingly. For example, in Germany, regions with a culturally diverse labor force have higher innovation outputs. This diversity also increases the supply of goods and services, which improves overall quality of life. In fact, multicultural policies and positive intergroup contact help reduce prejudice and promote social cohesion in society. Who would have thought that interacting with other people different to you makes you less prejudiced? The evidence is extremely clear. When individuals from different backgrounds interact positively, they are more likely to develop mutual understanding and respect, and economies benefit. Likewise, no European culture has suffered. European languages, art, music, architecture, social structures, ways of doing business, they're all intact and in fact heavily enriched by the presence of cultural diversity. Some of the greatest exports, particularly cultural, both of the United States and Europe, have been carried out by either enslaved populations that were eventually brought to these countries or immigrants. Look at art, music, even scientific endeavors. Have you ever walked into a large hospital anywhere in Europe? The far right exists to manufacture moral panic and distract from failures of the capitalist system. The current hot points revolve around critical race theory, gender identity, and immigration. These are waved higher over more pressing problems like mass shootings, poverty, broken healthcare systems, lack of political transparency, climate change, wage theft, the dictatorship of the firm, the complete lack of democracy economically, and the facade of democracy politically. All of this is swept aside for discussions of your slightly darker neighbor who might have a white female partner. Oh, the fucking horror. The fixation on culture war issues, specifically against educational institutions, also kind of lays the foundation for an eventual violent path to quote-unquote correct things. Legislative agendas and bans like those in Florida mirror this trend by trying to silence dissent while promoting a singular reactionary narrative. Across Europe, far-right groups are entering quote-unquote respectable politics, hoping to make fascist ideas palatable to the mainstream and the average person in order to grow their numbers and, well, history provides plenty of examples of what they want to do next. You don't need to take my word for it. A look at the comment section of anything about immigration will show you people who are outright calling for concentration camps for immigrants simply not looking like them. Just a side note, the eventual political consequences of white genocide thinking actively harms white people. Hitler's genocidal wars, directly inspired by this kind of thinking in a more primordial state, caused way more white people to die than any potential immigration or internal enemy ever could. Had he succeeded, he would have turned inwards by making whiteness more and more exclusive, resulting in even more white people suffering the fate of Romani, Jewish, and other exterminated races. And by that I mean French people and Italians and Spaniards and God knows what else. You even see this between insignificant white nationalist groups now, bickering between themselves as they yell that Romanians or Croats or the Portuguese aren't really white and hence should be corrected. This nonsense has had a deeply negative impact globally. Historical analyses indicate that racial violence linked to this conspiracy is pervasive amongst certain segments of white Americans because of a legacy of anti-black propaganda and institutionalized racial hatred. Research has found that simply exposing somebody to attitudes about racial demographic change can lead to increased support for political violence and anti-black views. That's fucking insane. This perceived threat to white status is evident in the following pattern. The more black people gain a bit of political agency, such as during Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era, the more under threat white people perceive themselves to be. The stark reality of this theory's influence is made even clearer with events like the Buffalo shooting in 2022, where the attacker cited the Great Replacement theory as a key motivation. He's not the only one. What's scarier is that some surveys show that a significant proportion of American and Europeans feel threatened by increasing diversity, with conservatives being particularly susceptible to the theory's rhetoric. What a surprise. This ideology not only fuels mass violence, but also provides politicians and media figures with stories of invasion and disruption of traditional values, which they can use to drive up ratings. There are of course broader social implications here. Hate crimes have lasting psychological and physical impacts on victims and their communities. Even the US Commission on Civil Rights understands the critical need to address and prosecute hate crimes effectively, since they, rightly, very often lead to large-scale protests and massive social disruption. Hate crimes are not only violent acts, but also attempt to spread fear at targeted communities. Proponents of this misguided replacement nonsense see the disruption of traditional values, funnily enough mostly perpetrated by white or European thinkers, artists, activists, etc., as a threat to their way of life, which pushes some people further towards white nationalist and fascist ideas. This creates a perfect environment for hate crimes to become more likely and socially acceptable, laying the foundation for even more violence, particularly if power is captured. The idea that white people are being deliberately replaced by non-white immigrants, orchestrated by some shadowy group of elites, is pure nonsense. I really hope that's crystal clear. The theory isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It actively seeks to tap into people's fear, increase and exploit their ignorance, and encourage horrific racial violence. The theory claims that Western civilization is being threatened by non-white immigrants, as if migrants fleeing situations, insert Western country here, caused was equivalent in any sense to an army or colonialism, or the genocide of Native Americans. Despite what some insane people think, children are not the soldiers. Families trying to create a better life for their children aren't SEAL Team 6, they're just people like you and I. It speaks volumes to the complete emptiness of an ideology that relies on, or requires, in whole or in part, dehumanization of other people for the crime of having been born somewhere different. Immigration, as shown by numerous studies, does indeed contribute to population growth. This is how addition works. Immigrants typically have higher birth rates because many are of childbearing age when they arrive, which naturally boosts the population. They aren't nefarious baby-making machines pumping out soldiers here to kill you. This isn't some calculated move to erase white people, it's just basic demographic math. The net growth won't make whites a minority by basically every measure, and even in highly multicultural countries like Britain, the most optimistic growth rates would just make white Britons, in many decades, if not even centuries, the largest ethnic group in Britain by a large majority, but a slight minority compared to if you take all other non-Britons in one measure, which is silly because it assumes all non-Britons to be non-white, and that non-whites are united on simply not being white. You see how stupid this thinking is. Likewise, the idea that immigrants can't ever possibly become part of a nation even after several generations, and that the idea of being, for example, French is solely tied to whiteness, is historically myopic and, well, just racist. It also implies that historically immigrant nations like the settler colonies of the US, Australia, etc. could never become indigenous either, hence warranting correction for the actual indigenous of these countries, but that would require consistency of thought and a lack of hypocrisy. It's okay in those cases because it's white people doing it. Otherwise, it's not okay. There are many European nations with negligible immigration experiencing significant demographic decline with no outside influence. Maybe the white genocide is coming from inside the house. This is also true across the globe. Immigration supports economic and demographic stability, and since immigrants don't displace native workers, they integrate, contribute, and help sustain the labor market. When there are issues with immigration, they're usually a result of institutionalized discrimination, qualification mismatch, mistaken integration policy, or just economic downturns, all of which can be reversed or corrected. The most glaring issue with all of this is, who genuinely cares? Why do these people care so much about supposedly being replaced, which by the way isn't happening? My country, Iraq, has experienced population shifts dozens of times, but we remain having intermixed with practically every population to pass through. To me, the explanation is simple. White extinction anxiety exists because a loss of a certain level of privilege as the dominant, culturally hegemonic group is a possibility, and we've all heard how equality feels like oppression to those previously favored in a system. If people are worried about low birth rates, no matter the color or country, the cause is simple. Life is expensive and raising kids is difficult. Inflation, climate change anxiety, schooling, access to healthcare, employment, just the daily requirements of life. There isn't some evil cabal trying to import people, but an actual economic necessity that the current capitalist system has caused. All this is stuff that can be politically solvable. Instead of focusing on ethnic hatred and racism, advocate for people-first policies that will actually encourage people to have children if you really give a shit. The real threat surrounding the conspiracy theory has to do with the political consequences. In recent years, the Great Replacement has undergone attempts at mainstreaming, which have brought with it serious consequences, including insane acts of terrorism. White nationalists, inspired by this theory, have committed unspeakable atrocities. If you give them power, they, by their own words, will not hesitate to carry out even more horrific violence in the service of capital and of a mythical idea of Europe that simply doesn't exist. The right often goes on and on about leftist snowflakes, but I can't think of anything more fragile than some guy who can't stand that there are 1% more darker-skinned people in this country, and that some of them might have white wives. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too. Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.